Hello, and thank you all for joining this webinar, the webinar called Where the Trees Growing? Advanced in Forest and Landscape Restoration Monitoring. Thank you all for joining. My name is Fred Stoll. I'm the Deputy Director of the Forest team here at the World Resource Institute, and I will be the moderator of this webinar today. The format of today's webinar will be a series of speakers about needs and technologies and skills, concluding remarks by Ms. Elke Steinmetz from the German Ministry of Environment, and then we directly go into a panel discussion for about 20 minutes. During the entire webinar, feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We have experts at the ready who will try live to reply to your questions and comments in the chat box. We also might bring your questions up to the panel discussion in the second part of this webinar. Restoration monitoring. Personally, I've been involved in monitoring for a long time, but only 4 years ago when we started with restoration monitoring, I found out that I always have worked on the easy side of restoration, the deforestation monitoring. The deforestation monitoring was kind of easier. Restoration is often more dispersed in small projects or millions of hectares of commitments of slow-growing trees. And how to get it accurate measured was much more challenging than I thought. And the need to measure this is growing. We need to have more an idea of how much negative emission there is for the climate. We need to understand how investments change the restoration and what is the pay for performance. There are many pledges made on restoration. So how to monitor it all, how to get opportunities in rural developments. So there's a lot of need for it. And we hope with these new methods that we show in this almost 1.5 hour in this webinar to see how can we shift to making it as easy to monitor and restoration as Global Forest Watch did like 6 years ago. Now, having mentioned Global Forest Watch, I'm very happy to announce our first distinguished speaker, the Director of Global Forest Watch, who has been leading this GFW initiative, giving guidance and direction to one of our large initiatives at WRI for over the last 5 years, Ms. Crystal Davis. Crystal, the next 5 minutes are yours.
Thank you, Fred. It's an honor to be here and to help kick off this conversation. Let me just start by saying that restoration monitoring is an incredibly exciting and fast-moving space right now. The world of deforestation monitoring had its big moment back in 2014 when we launched Global Forest Watch and the now infamous global annual tree cover loss data produced by the University of Maryland. I fully expect that restoration monitoring is going to have a similar moment in the coming years. That said, I'll let the technical experts on this webinar talk about why and how this new data revolution is emerging. What I'd like to talk to you about is why it's so important. First of all, I fundamentally believe in the critical importance of independent monitoring alongside official government-sponsored monitoring systems. Until we have the ability to monitor forests so accurately and so definitively that the truth of what is happening to forests on the ground is self-evident, we need independent data to foster transparency, to create accountability. And I also think that this dynamic creates a very healthy, if sometimes contentious, race to the top in terms of the data and science underpinning the monitoring systems. Global Forest Watch has already demonstrated the value of independent monitoring in the context of combating deforestation. But we've been really hamstrung over the years by the fact that we're only showing half the equation. We see where forests are disappearing, but we don't yet see where forests are growing back. And this creates a very lopsided view of the world and compounds the unfortunate tendency of policymakers and investors to treat conservation and restoration as separate agendas. But I think we all know that when we drill down to the local level, we see how intertwined the loss and growth of trees can be within a landscape. And we see a need for more holistic solutions. And if we want those holistic solutions, we also need holistic monitoring systems to support them. I'd like to touch briefly on the importance of this work in the context of climate change in particular. I think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, the climate doesn't care about politics. It cares about carbon. So it doesn't care about how a bunch of politicians agree to officially define forests or deforestation or restoration under the UNFCCC. It cares about the carbon stored into soil and trees. So being able to monitor changes in tree cover in a more biophysical sense, whether these trees exist within or outside of officially delineated forests, is a really critical input to being able to accurately monitor carbon emissions and removals. Just a couple weeks ago, a team of researchers at TNC and WRI published a new paper showing that letting forests regrow naturally on already cleared land has the potential to absorb almost 9 billion metric tons of carbon each year through 2050, which is about a quarter of global annual emissions. Now, the reality is that not all of these lands will be allowed to regenerate naturally, but this spatially explicit data arms policymakers with the information they need to decide which lands to prioritize for different types of restoration interventions. So I think I'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to the panel discussion a little later.
Thank you, Crystal. That are interesting words to start thinking about the restoration data and how important this is in our current day. Without further ado, I also like to move to the next distinguished speaker. The second speaker we have is Ms. Lina Paul. She's the FAO representative in Mexico, and of course also known as the former Minister of the Environment of El Salvador, but even best known as the initiator of the UN Decade on Restoration. Lina, we are very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours for the next 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this important presentation. I really have a strong personal connection to restoration. As Minister of Environment and Natural Resources in my country, El Salvador, I quickly came to realize that over 90% of our land was severely degraded. It was clear that was a threat to the health and prosperity of my country. Restoring land by growing trees, revitalizing grassland, and helping farmers produce more sustainable, I knew could help solve many of El Salvador's most pressing problems, from declining crop yields to water stress and mitigation of climate change. The ideal scenario would be to restore key landscape like Sahel and other places of Africa, India, or China that could be restored in big scale. But I also like to see my region become a sustainable development area with resilient food system, the dry corridor in Central American region, for instance. It would be a dream come true to talk of a biodiverse corridor instead of a dry one. And I'm sure this will happen. I also knew that restoration was a path toward achieving those goals and many other goals, that embarking on this journey will lead to positive change for the whole country, transforming the half of the country, 1.25 million hectares, that could benefit from restoration into healthy landscape was too great of an opportunity to pass up. My strong belief in the power of restoration and in multilateral cooperation through efforts like the Bond Challenge, the Initiative 2020, and Africa 100 led me to propose that the United Nations declared 2021-2030 the decade on ecosystem restoration. The goal was to mobilize funding and push commitments, communities, countries, and the private sector also to achieve this commitment to restore over 210 million hectares of degraded land in areas larger than Mexico. Now, in my new role at FAO in Mexico, I'm working tireless to make the next decade prosperous for people, not only in my country, but in the whole world. Since majority of poor and food insecurity continue to live in rural areas, achieving SDG 1 and SDG 2, reduce poverty and zero hunger, requires focusing on agriculture and rural areas and transforming of the economy. The classic structural transformation, the classic productivity paradigm, technology, productivity, markets, food security, It's no longer possible, no longer enough. Now we have more people on the poverty line, rising inequality within countries over multiple dimensions, persisting nature of gender discrimination. The classic paradigm has contributed to climate change and eroding natural resources base, increasing obesity, increasing global political and economic volatility. And post-COVID, the situation is worse. We need to change the paradigm. Restoration is the key action, but there is a challenge. Climate and nature-based solution, the big narratives, give little priority to inclusivity. So all explicitly or implicitly fail to fully consider importance of the livelihood in poor people, the vulnerability of the people. So if we're going to restore the planet, we need to make an inclusive transformation. And for that vision, we need proof that restoration works and thus bring this benefit to people. There is only one way to get that proof: independent progress tracking that can complement government data. The first step there is to get better and seeing where trees are growing in the landscape. When we can see where the trees are growing in the landscape, we can measure the water, livelihoods, and other benefits that increased tree cover can bring. Tracking progress is more than saying we are X% toward achieving our goals. It encourages people to replicate successful projects, inspire funders to continue investment where they can see past progress, and show to the global community that these pledges are not thin air. It shows that there is action behind our words. When I was a minister, these are all reasons why we invest in monetary restoration. Today, my colleague and my friend, my dear friend, Renee Zamora Cristales, will highlight what we've been able to achieve in my country, in my home country, a simple index built from sophisticated yet available data. I hope that this example and recent advances at the global and project level can inspire you all to invest in tracking progress toward a better, more sustainable future. I'm excited about the new techniques that will be presented today that can help make restoration monitoring accessible, useful, and easier for everyone. Actually, WRA, you are the best of doing this. Let's restore our land and our future, of course. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lina. Thanks for that. And thanks for painting the picture on how restoration links to these large issues like degradation, climate, but especially poverty and the need to prove towards progress. Thank you for those words, Lina. That was very inspiring. Now, before I go to the next session where we actually dive into those methods, I first want to give a little shout out to all the partners we work with in this universe. Of course, WRA is working on this, as you heard, but there is a universe of other groups that we work very close with and our partnership, and we move each other forwards. And you see some of the logos here, the FAO, which as well as the UN Decade of Restoration Monitoring, but they also do Collect Earth, and there's also the Restoration Initiative really working on it. Climate Focus, and of course our longtime partner, the University of Maryland, the Global Land Analysis and Discovery Lab. There's a crowd of group people working on this, and we're very happy to be part of that and partnering those groups. Now, working with those groups not alone, I also would say the next slides, we also have our own monitoring team. And, just to take a few people, you will hear soon from Bernadette, she's living and working in Rwanda. We have people in India. Pulakash is one of our workers who works on a new way of how to monitoring agroforestry. Next slides. And then we have people in Brazil, Marcelo, also on the line here, who is working on Brazil, one of the largest restoration monitoring initiatives that we have. Peter in Kenya, working very close with some subnational authorities who really want to have an interest in what is happening in my area. So many of these colleagues are online. So if you have questions, also, please send that question in the chat box and they'll try to respond as soon as possible. Now, after this intermezzo, we really want to dive into the meat of this presentation here. And that is like, what are those different techniques of restoration monitoring that we are also interested about? Now, 3 scales, 1 vision, Vision is transparent, easy measurement of progress of restoration. But we divided up in 3 different scales. And we did it because each scale has some different demands on the data and the methods. As you can imagine, a small project, you almost need to count every tree. But if the commitment to a country is in millions of hectares, you need different techniques. Also, some of the techniques are very suitable with new algorithm, new satellite for one technique, for one scale, and not so for the other scale. That doesn't mean that these techniques and scales are mutually exclusive. They actually blend very much, and you can use the different techniques in different scales, but you will hear the different speakers who will follow now tell them why it so works well on this scale. Next slide, please. So we'll start with project scales. And I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, John. John is working with a bunch of new algorithms, often named as artificial intelligence, to be able to detect those progress on those project scales. And I think there are some very exciting results he will show us. John, the floor is yours for the next 8 minutes.
Thank you, Fred. And I think all of you will agree that our project monitoring work is very exciting. With increased investment in restoration projects through initiatives such as the Bond Challenge, the Trillion Tree Initiative, as well as regional initiatives such as AFR100 and 20 by 20, there has been an ever-increasing need for transparent, independent monitoring of restoration projects that use the best available science. WRI has a 3-pronged approach to supporting project monitoring efforts. We directly engage in monitoring individual projects. We create and provide baseline data that's relevant to both landscapes and to projects. And finally, we create change detection data that tracks progress. Of importance, at this point in time, we're only considering restoration interventions that directly involve tree planting or tree growth. So agroforestry, reforestation, enrichment planting, and similar types of restoration. As we're showing our work, please also note that many of these innovations are still being innovated, and we're happy to work with interested parties to continue to fine-tune our approach. Next slide. As opposed to deforestation, tree growth has to be measured consistently over a long, from 5 to 15-year period of time. WRI combines various methods of independent monitoring to holistically measure tree planting efforts all of the way from site preparation towards ensuring long-term success. Next slide. The first of the 3 aspects of project monitoring that I want to discuss is the big picture vision of tracking projects over time. We are creating an easy-to-use dashboard for project developers, implementers, and financiers that will allow users to track important metrics of biophysical and social and economic success at the project and fund or portfolio level. This will be available in the future on platforms such as TerraMatch, which is WRI's platform that connects restoration financiers with implementers. As you can see in the screenshot on the right, a quick example of what this will look like. It will include data to track progress over time in terms of tree cover gain, estimated carbon, and we'll combine these sort of top-down satellite sensed data with project reported data on households being affected and any types of incidents, et cetera, to develop an index of success and progress that stakeholders will be able to track over time. Next slide. All of WRI's project monitoring efforts are powered by advanced artificial intelligence that uses free satellite imagery. This allows us to bring incredibly high quality data, such as that pictured here in Makueni County in Kenya, to any landscape, anywhere in the world, for next to zero cost for the first time. This data focuses on trees outside of forests, which are trees on farms, trees in built up areas, trees on grassland, trees on degraded land, and trees in other land. The accuracy of this data for measuring both trees outside of forests, as well as tree cover gain, is unparalleled. As you can see in this quick GIF that we have included here, The accuracy of measuring where these trees are allows us to, for the first time ever, track at a very small scale changes in tree cover, measured as tree cover gain. Next slide. This method works just as well in northern Ethiopia in the region of Tigray as it does in the previous slide in Makueni County in Kenya. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, so here, thanks. As well as in CD in India, which is in Madhya Pradesh. This data can provide important baseline information for both individual projects as well as mosaic landscape restoration initiatives to help stakeholders track progress. Next slide. This is no longer just a pilot. We have developed landscape-specific results that use a globally consistent approach across 75 landscapes, 2 million hectares, and 36 countries. It is peer-reviewed and forthcoming in a peer-reviewed journal and open source. It uses satellite data that is freely available to respond to needs on the ground and uses what we've learned from engaging with projects all around the world. Additionally, this builds off of the Collect Earth method that Bernadette, my colleague, will discuss with you later, and creates data that can fit well within a suite of other monitoring techniques, such as the index that Renee will also present later. Next slide. Our last and perhaps most relevant section for the audience here, section for project monitoring, is an example of tracking implementation of restoration over time. Here is a satellite image of a mosaic landscape restoration project in Extrema, Brazil, that totals about 20,000 hectares of land. The white borders delineate where tree planting has occurred or is planned to occur. In this satellite image, the dark green are trees, the light green are either degraded land, cropland, or fallow land. Extrema is an iconic municipality in Brazil for implementing a payment for ecosystem services policy, and it is a very important source of water for Sao Paulo. Next, we want to demonstrate the use of free satellite imagery to monitor restoration implementation over just 2 years. As this slide shows, we are able to generate detailed, high-quality maps of tree cover gain, and tree cover loss over a very short time period from just 2017 to 2019, using a model that works anywhere in the world. The green here shows persistent tree cover from 2017 to 2019. The pink shows loss, and the purple shows gain. For the first time here, at a landscape scale, it's clear how this data can be used to track overall progress in the landscape, how much new tree cover has been created, how much has been lost. Now we will dive into this landscape to see a few examples of just how accurate this data can be. Next slide. Specifically, we'll be looking at these 3 sections within this landscape, within these projects. Next slide. In this first example here, we see mosaic tree planting has occurred on areas that range from 1/4 hectare up to 5 hectares. And types of restoration include enrichment planting, goalie planting, and reforestation. As seen in purple on the left, we are able to accurately measure where tree planting is occurring within these project polygons. And you can see for yourself on the right with 2 high-resolution satellite images that these tree planting initiatives have indeed taken place. Next slide. Here, in a somewhat smaller example, we're able to track just a 1 hectare tree planting project on these 2 side-by-side farms in the bottom right. At the same time, we are able to simultaneously track the removal of small patches of trees over just a 2-year time period from 2017 to 2019. Next slide. Finally, on my third and my last example, and believe me, I wanted to share hundreds of these examples with you all, but we had limited time. On a very heterogeneous hilly area that had initial tree cover, we're still able to track enrichment planting efforts that are distributed within a 50 hectare polygon. As you can see in purple, as well as in the satellite images from 2017 to 2019. Taken as a whole, these examples show that we can monitor restoration progress in just 2 years using free satellite imagery for next to 0 cost, even when the restoration is mosaic, and even when the restoration consists of a number of different implementation types all occurring at once distributed through a landscape. Next slide. Wrapping up the project monitoring section, this slide shows the 3 main ways in which WRI engages with restoration projects. We support individual project monitoring efforts that combine remote sensing data with field reported data on a platform like TerraMatch that enables stakeholders, both implementers and financiers, to measure progress over time. We are developing landscape and jurisdictional baselines, and we are using satellite imagery to measure progress over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. It is stunning to see the accuracy and where we have gone with these new algorithms and those new methods. It is a big step forward. I also want to add that we also working on a project monitoring protocol. We did it together with Unique, one of our partner organizations, which our former colleague Florence Landsberg has worked very closely, and we also hopefully at the end of this year have some idea like how do we combine to really have a good measurement of what project monitoring could be. But I want to go directly to the next scale what we're talking about. So we've talked about this very detailed scale of monitoring, and as I said, they're not mutually exclusive. Of course, they can go into the landscape and be used there. And to how they're used there and what landscape monitoring is, I'm really happy to hand over to Dao, our restoration monitoring manager, and her team. Dao, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Fred. Our engagement with countries really began at the national ministries in charge of forest and landscape restoration, like Lena that you heard speak earlier. They wanted to show data and results. And at that time, countries made political commitments through the Bond Challenge and respective country-owned regional initiatives like Initiative 2020 and AFR100. Next slide. This meant that we were working hand in hand with specialists from forest agencies and land planning agencies, and we scaled up tested tools like the Road to Restoration. This tool facilitates governments, businesses, and communities, and anyone really actively working on restoration to identify priorities and set up goals grounded in their reality. Next slide. And we sought for opportunities to bring together GIS students from local universities, agronomists, M&E specialists, and project managers from local NGOs and agencies, and in some cases, like India, members of the farmer cooperatives, to build their skills on tools and approaches that would be sustained and owned by them over time. Next slide. To date, we have worked in 12 priority landscapes. We don't have time to cover all of them today, but Bernadette will start with our approach in Africa, followed by Renee, who will speak to the case in El Salvador. And as a reminder, please ask your questions in real time. We do have technical experts who can respond to them. With that, over to you, Bernadette.
Thanks, Dao. So about 30 countries across the African continent have made forest and landscape restoration pledges under the Bond Challenge and have joined the African Forestry and Restoration Initiative, also known as the AFR100. Both initiatives aim to restore degraded and deforested lands by 2030. Next slide. At the World Resources Institute, we are currently supporting 5 countries on the continent in the development of systems to guide restoration action on the ground and to track progress. We work with national and local stakeholders to support the development of monitoring frameworks that identify indicators and metrics best suited to show where restoration is successful or where more investment is needed. We also train and work with those stakeholders in the use of robust and transparent approaches for monitoring restoration. For instance, we have deployed the Collector tool to assess tree cover at the national scale in Rwanda and at subnational scales in Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Niger, and Cameroon. In the next slide, I want to tell you a little bit more about how we are using Collector. So Collector is an open source tool developed by FAO. We use it for systematic assessments of the freely available high-resolution satellite imagery hosted in Google Earth. We follow an approach that involves stakeholders throughout the whole process. For instance, we hold group consultations to agree on the main questions to be answered with Collector data. We identify the available spatial data to build from and the existing monitoring frameworks Collector data will be plugged into. We train the stakeholders in how the tool works and facilitate their participation in data collection sessions that we also call mapathons. The stakeholders are also involved in data validation activities that include field verification and other desktop-based validation techniques. Stakeholders are further also participate in data analysis and the dissemination of results. So we take this participatory approach to make sure that the data collected are useful and they answer existing restoration monitoring needs. This participatory approach also helps us to build local capacity in the use of this tool. Next slide. So here are some examples of what we see during data collection using Collect Earth. So we use Collect Earth in Rwanda to interpret high-resolution Google imagery, and we were able to identify the mainland cover around 2011 when Rwanda made its restoration pledge to the Bones Challenge initiative. Then we were able to assess the changes that have happened in a particular place since then. Here, for instance, you see a forest plantation in 2011 that was cleared around 2017 and replaced with other land use, including settlements. Next slide. This example shows land in Western Rwanda that was mainly cropland in 2006, but has since undergone natural regeneration. The forest is clearly visible in 2019. Next slide. So not only are we able to see the general changes in land cover, but we can also start to make estimates on tree cover, particularly outside of forest, as shown in this example from Malawi. This is one of the strengths of using Collect Earth tool. Many tree cover assessments generally miss data on tree cover when trees are scattered or mixed with other land cover types. So we use this collected Collect Earth data to produce tree cover statistics to start putting a number on the status of tree-based restoration activities in a particular landscape. Collect Earth data are also used as an input into artificial intelligence models that John has shared and in other integrated restoration monitoring frameworks, as you will see in the following presentations. Thank you.
So now we are going to talk about the index, the Sustainability Index for Landscape Restoration. This was an effort that we developed we co-create this. The index is a process, not a standard, or it's basically a process that takes you through your objectives, your indicators, and then how you weight them or associate them or aggregate them in metrics. And this is part of Initiative 20 by 20 efforts. WRI as secretariat, but also as a technical partner, has developed the technical support to co-create this with the countries and with other partners. Next, please. So the steps for building an index, basically, is we have these 6 steps, which is, you identify your landscape first, then you go with the stakeholders, the main stakeholders that you have. Then you have the objectives and goals. And once you have that, you need to define your baseline, as you know, and then your target, because then you can really measure, And then once you have all these components of the index that you want, that you can go from some biophysicals, as the one that my colleagues were talking before. You can go also with some others that are more in the socioeconomic aspects, because as everybody knows here, restoration is not just about biophysical aspects. It has to take into account other aspects, and it's about impacts, basically, as Lina Paul mentioned before, impacts in the people. And once you have that, you can normalize and aggregate and weight, and then you can report. Basically, the index is a way, like when you were in school and you do a test or a quiz, you have a score, and that tells you, more or less where you are. And that's the basic principle behind this. Next, please. So starting with your objectives, you can have different objectives. You can start with the, for example, the road to restoration, which was a publication we did in the past, which you can define your objectives based on big themes that you have. And for example, here I have just some examples, but you have biodiversity, water. Of course, you always want the best indicator to measure, but you need to take into account that in many cases you don't have the data, or you might have the data one time, but you cannot take that data frequently. Next, please. Once you have your objective, you define, what are the indicators you want. For example, if you are working on climate mitigation, you might say increasing forest cover is one of the important things for my landscape. But then you need to define what is your baseline, in terms of hectares, in terms of any metrics that you want to use. It could be tons of carbon. And then you want to identify the target and the time frame, because you want to achieve this in 5, 10, 15 years. And those are important steps because you need really to set your baseline and then compare as you move forward. Next, please. And then once you have everything set up, you can start setting up your, basically aggregate your results and using a scoring system. You can go, for example, from 0 to 100, or in some countries it's from 0 to a 6, depending on how do you feel, what is your top. But that's not relevant to discuss now. The relevance is that you can score based on different objectives. You basically aggregate them. And you might say, but for me, water is more important than forest cover. And in that case, you can also weigh them if you want. The problem is, as you know, is that many of these objectives are entangled. They are not really, you cannot really separate them in some cases. And that's always tricky to do. But that's, the next step. And once you achieve that, you can start to do progress, as you see here in this table. And then you can start see how the score is moving up or moving down. And that is just depending on your objectives. Next, please. And of course, you can compare different scenarios. You can start planning also. It's more about strategic planning. And you can tell, what if in this case, we have 3 objectives here that you see in the screen. What if mitigation and biodiversity are less important for me than community? And then you can see how the score changes. So if you make more progress in community, your score will increase faster because that's the most important objective that you have. Again, how to weigh these objectives is tricky because some of them are joint and difficult. Next, please. And then to finalize, as I said, the index, we co-create the index when the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of El Salvador, GIZ, and Prisma Foundation in El Salvador, and other partners. And then with the team that we convened, we had this index created in El Salvador with their indicators, with their processes, with the information that was available. And in the case of what you see here is a landscape, which is Apaneca, El Imposible, Barra de Santiago, Ilamatepec, it's a long name. You see the score. El Salvador is from 0 to 1. This landscape is 0.39. And you see the different indicators here that we measure. And it's not just biophysicals, we measure also governance and vulnerability and others, but that's just a real world example that this is feasible and possible. And it's, again, it's a process, it's not an end product, it's not a recipe. This is a co-creation with many partners. So thank you, and please, Dow.
Thanks, Bernadette and Renee, for great examples of collaboration and technologies that allow for inclusive participation. So what's next for us? Well, there's a high demand for co-creation and to strengthen skills to monitor broadly. So we'd like to continue to engage with district governments, community organizations, and landscape initiatives that want EC to use tools and methods to manage this process on their own. We want to meet this need, but we also know we can't be everywhere. So we'd love to work with you to reach out to more trainers. And second, we also see an emerging opportunity to empower landscape leaders and managers with data on restoration progress. So this work we know is long-term, and we want this data to be used in ways that celebrate early wins and adaptive management. So we saw examples earlier in Brazil, and Marcelo can speak to this too. He's working with multiple stakeholders to make sense of data that already exists. And last but not least, we are exploring how to bring social data into the monitoring systems. And with that, I'm going to hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dow, Renee, and Bernadette. As you see, this landscape scale it's such an interesting scale because there's top-down techniques meet bottom-up techniques, and where you have to talk to the landscape and use this new technologies. And it's very interesting to see the progress also here made. And thank you, colleagues, for that. Now, not the last scale, but not the least, of course, is the national and the global scale. We are also interested to see, like, where are we with our pledges to the bond challenge or sustainable development goal or the nationally determined contributions under the UNFCCCs. And so can we compare countries where we could go, and are we already close to where we need to be? Now, hopefully the answer Katie will give. So Katie, the floor is yours for the next 8 minutes.
Thank you, Fred, and good morning, everyone. As we heard earlier, and we all know, international momentum for forest landscape restoration has been building for some time now, starting with the Bond Challenge in 2011, the New York Declaration on Forests in 2014, and regional initiatives like AFR100 and Initiative 20 by 20. These alliances have inspired pledges to restore upwards of 210 million hectares in more than 60 countries around the world. However, there is currently no systematic way of monitoring these commitments, which would allow us to truly understand the impact that they've had on ecosystems across the globe. So for the last year or so, we've been working on how best to tackle this question and monitor restoration on this global scale. As one step forward in this direction, next slide. In 2019, we conducted a pilot study that focused on the Mekong region of Southeast Asia as part of the New York Declaration on Forests Goal 5 Progress Assessment, which was led by Climate Focus, to see how feasible it was to estimate restoration progress on a multinational scale. This project sought to answer two key questions. Firstly, how much has tree cover changed between 2011 and 2018? And secondly, how does it compare amongst the 5 countries of the region? And we tackled these questions using 2 approaches, because restoration is not just about increases in dense forest area, but it's also about interventions like agroforestry and similar types that add sparse tree cover to cropland settlements and other non-forest land uses. And to try to capture all types of tree-based restoration, we found that we needed to use 2 different methods and data sets that were better suited for each type of restoration, which we call here trees inside the forest and trees outside the forest. So for inside the forest, we used a regional Landsat-based tree cover change data set that was produced by the University of Maryland. And for trees outside the forest, we used a collect earth method, which my colleague Bernadette presented on earlier. And the maps here show, display the results, and they're summarized on an administrative level. And these results were published in the NYDF Goal 5 Progress Report that was released in September 2019. And the results showed a net loss in trees inside the forest, but a net gain in sparse tree cover outside the forest, and very mixed results on a province by province basis. But this really represented for us a first cut approach at how we could potentially put together a progress report for restoration on this multinational scale. Next slide, please. And so the pilot study in general was a bit of a wake-up call to show us that there's very little data available on a global or even regional scale that enables any kind of restoration progress assessment across countries. And we need to start investing more in producing data on tree cover gain and similar data sets globally, and actually creating data that doesn't currently exist in order to understand where restoration is having a positive impact. And so with this in mind, in late 2019, we came together with Climate Focus and many other partners listed here to found the Global Restoration Observatory, which we call GROW for short. And the objective of GROW is to develop a globally consistent, regularly updated data on restoration progress. And we want to increase the impact of initiatives like the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, the IUCN Restoration Barometer, and national reporting of NDCs and other similar platforms. And as part of the GROW Consortium, we have initiated a series of working groups to develop spatial data platform and a project database and case studies about restoration progress. And our aim is to develop the best available peer-reviewed science on restoration progress. To that end, one of the first activities that we initiated as part of GROW was, sorry, next slide, was investing time and resources in exploring and improving the tree cover gain data in other parts of the world besides the Mekong. And we started in Latin America. And our colleagues at the University of Maryland produced a new prototype tree cover gain data set for Latin America. It uses Landsat imagery into text tree cover gain between 2011 and 2018. And to explore this data set more closely and investigate trends in net tree cover change, we conducted a pilot study of 6 countries in Central America. So we used baseline tree cover from 2010 and the annual tree cover loss data from Global Forest Watch and combined it with the prototype tree cover gain data set to look at trends in net tree cover change over that 2011 to 2018 time period. Next slide, please. And we found that in total, but in the time period, 3 countries in Central America, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Guatemala, had net increases in tree cover, while 3 countries, Belize, Honduras, and Nicaragua, had net losses. And in total, for the entire 6-country region, there was a gross gain of 1,903 million hectares of tree cover, but this was offset by a net loss of 2,222 million hectares, with an overall net loss of 320 million hectares. And the findings of this study will be part of the forthcoming New York Declaration on Forests Goal 5 update that will be released in November by Climate Focus. And so this again was a pilot study, and we're currently working on exploring and refining more data sets as part of GROW. Next slide, please. And so these 2 pilot studies that I mentioned are both steps toward our ambition to develop a globally relevant restoration progress index that enables comparison across countries and sets a standard that we can use to understand exactly how much progress we have made on restoration. And we also recognize that restoration is not just a matter of measuring change in tree cover. We also need to measure the impacts that restoration is having on the broader landscape, such as on soils, on carbon sequestration, water quality, biodiversity, and of course, people. Reasons for implementing restoration in the first place. And these are just as important to measure. And so we're also working towards incorporating these impact indicators into a broader index of restoration progress. Yeah, with that, thank you. And I'll hand it back over to Fred.
Thanks, Katie. It's exciting to see, as Crystal said also in the first part of her talk, like, this the other half of GFW, the last, slide where you see it is in Central America, great initiatives to restore, but unfortunately also deforestation, and combining the data gets so much more powerful. Now, this was the end of the technical parts of this seminar, and I would like to turn for the concluding remarks for this technical panel to turn to Ms. Elke Steinmetz from the German Ministry of Environment. We are very happy to have you with us, Elke, and the floor is yours for the next 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Fred, and I hope you can hear me clearly because I had some difficulties with my connecting line. So, okay, I see a thumbs up. Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. I'm honored, and I thank you, Fred and WRI, for inviting me to contribute to this important webinar. It has been already exciting to listen to the presentations, and Yeah, I was offered to speak here and share our view from a donor country's perspective, namely the Federal German Ministry for the Environment, and I'm happy to do that. Well, as many of you know, Germany is one of the most intensively engaged donors in the field of forest and landscape restoration globally, addressing all aspects of restoration, policy support, implementation, capacity building, monitoring, and also addressing all levels, as were mentioned, global, landscape, project level. And our focus lies on, but is not limited to, the Bond Challenge and the various regional supporting initiatives. And I'm happy to say that we have a very good and close cooperation with WRI, both on project level and as well as on political influencing and exchange. Well, we as Germany, we have been supporting forest and landscape restoration since many years for a very simple reason. And this simple reason has a new name now. It's nature-based solution. Restoration, in our view, is an ideal, typical nature-based solution for sustainable development, including addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, and addressing threatened livelihoods. So why do we as Germany, or as German Ministry for the Environment, regard monitoring to be important? The answer is very simple again. It helps us to detect gaps of implementation and to improve implementation. It helps to record progress, to prove evidence and measure success. So the tools and methods that have been developed so far have brought major progress in monitoring, but there are several aspects that need to be improved from our point of view in order to get even better data as we need it today. I will not talk about any technical issues, I'll leave that to the experts, but I would like to highlight 3 issues that should have a priority in our view in further developing monitoring. And I think you will recall that many of the aspects were already touched upon during the presentations. And maybe Fred, you can use some of the aspects I will touch upon for the discussion following. So the first thing I want to touch upon is coordination is important and it has to be improved. But coordination in the sense of coherence, mutual exchange, and support. There are many more tools and methods than those we heard about in detail earlier today. Just let me mention Bond Challenge Barometer, the FAO specific monitoring tools like CEPAL and so on, and many others. I believe that any step to closer collaboration in the field of monitoring can bring a major asset. One example for close collaboration is an IKI project that was just released into its preparation phase, a restoration implementation facility, which we just call the hub, with IUCN, WWF, and WRI in the lead, but many partners to support. So the second field that needs to be improved from my point of view, there are new demands on the measurement of state. Saying that, I mean, setting up of baselines is getting more and more complex. But in order to monitor progress, you need to define as exact as possible where you start from. So I see special need for further improvement in the baselines for biodiversity, socioeconomic aspects, as well as in baselines for slowly changing systems like degradation of forests. I think this is very difficult to measure, but progress on this would be very helpful. And I know that WRI, together with other partners, is having a very close eye on that, which is good. And the third and last aspect is related to the second, but it's broader. It is the interrelation or interconnection of different variables that have to be monitored. I guess in this distinguished circle of participants today, we all agree that monitoring restoration cannot exclusively focus on carbon, but must take biodiversity, livelihoods, and other aspects equally important into account. And I guess that those wise people further developing monitoring tools should be open for further aspects, which we might even not have in mind yet. So openness for development of new variables that come in and are equally important. So by closing my remarks, let me come back to the bigger picture that was drawn by Lena Pohl. Thank you, Lena, for that. We are in the middle of a decisive time regarding the future of our planet. And we have committed ourselves to the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, and it is no surprise to say that forests, halting deforestation, and restoring forest ecosystem is at the very heart of this UN Decade. My state secretary in the ministry just recently said, if we do not succeed with this UN Decade, I cannot imagine another UN Decade to follow. And I think this is very wise and very true. And I guess that monitoring the progress, especially also in this decisive decade, is an important key to success. So let me thank you again, WRI, for inviting me and for setting up this important exchange and giving me the opportunity to contribute. And please let me say that I wish you and your families all the best in these difficult times, and I hope you stay safe and well. Thank you.
Thank you, Elke, very much for those thoughts and also for those interesting questions, which indeed I think we're gonna take to the next panel session. So with this time, we stop our speaker session and we directly move over to the seminar, the question and answer session, the panel session. For the panel session, I'd like to invite Lena, Katie, Renee, Crystal, and Bernadette to the virtual floor. From the audience, please keep your chats going. There are more than 50 questions already, and we're trying to deal with them as much as we can, but we cannot answer them all. But to start off the questions, I'll start with Bernadette. You heard Elke asking, like, how do we do with baselines? You can only measure progress if you know somewhere where you started. How should we see that?
Great, thank you, Fred. Like you just said, you can only manage what you can measure, and it's really important to establish this baseline before restoration projects start, to know the status or characteristics of a particular landscape, and have that information that you can then use for monitoring progress or identify specific places that may need specific attention. So we have already presented some of the tools that we use to monitor tree-based restoration progress. And like Lena Pohl mentioned, it's important to know where trees are growing before you start measuring other aspects that Elke just mentioned. So once we know where trees are growing, we plan to expand to other areas like biodiversity and other ecosystem services.
Thank you, Bernadette. Another issue that Elke brought up, Renee, is like, you talked about this index. And so how do you deal with different objectives? Because, as Elke said, carbon is important, but rural development, and Lena brought up the two, poverty reductions, they are very important in our restoration work. How do we deal with those?
Yeah, that's a challenge, certainly, because restoration is not just about carbon, as we said before, and many colleagues mentioned that it's about many components, including the socioeconomic, around people, around governance, around biophysicals too, and some of them are, as I say, entangled. So the key here is, how you aggregate them in a metric that is meaningful for the people living in those landscapes, and also for the people that is sort of planning the restoration, which is involved. It could be both groups. And one of the key elements, you know, is how you compare the trade-offs between one of them, because you cannot have all of them, of course, but you need to find a balance, and that's I think the tricky part of this effort. But it's important, and that's where the participation of the people that is living in the landscapes is key, because then you can have the different perspectives depending on how people use the resources in the landscape. Thanks.
Thank you, Nate. Crystal, I saw many in the chats, people say, you know, tree cover gain with satellite doesn't mean restoration. Obviously not. And how did Global Forest Watch deal with that, with the tree cover loss, the deforestation? Can you give us a little bit insight in there?
Sure. I think it's important to remember that we start with tree cover loss because it is what is readily measurable using satellite imagery, but it's not the goal or the endpoint. And when we launched Global Forest Watch in 2014, tree cover loss was our starting point. But what we've been able to do since then is add in additional contextual information that helps us understand different forms of tree cover that are being lost, whether it's intact primary forests or oil palm plantations, and also help us better understand what the drivers behind that loss are. And we're now able to see, in many cases, the difference between tree cover loss that is temporary in nature, associated with fire or forestry activities, versus tree cover loss that is more permanent in nature, including conversion to agriculture or other new land uses. So as we bring more data into the system, it tells a more complete picture over time.
Thanks, Crystal. So we have still a way to go with our restoration as GFW took that journey. Let me turn to Katie. Katie, you heard Elke say, like, you know, we need to improve our coordination. You know, many different groups are working on that. Can you tell us a little bit, you know, what's going on with the coordination part?
Sure, thanks, Fred. Yeah, that's a really important point, because there are, you know, a lot of experts in this space, and it's really important to capture all of their expertise in what we're doing. And so, as part of GROW and of you know, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that FAO is leading, we have a series of working groups that we've initiated. So we have, as part of GROW, we have different ones focusing on different themes that we're working on, like the spatial data management and assessment, and then also the project database and case studies, where we're pulling experts from different organizations to capitalize on their knowledge. And then also we're working with FAO as part of their working group to monitor the UN Decade and try to, you know, collaborate on indicators to make sure that we have some consistency across what indicators we're looking at, so that we are all on the same page and taking a similar approach to tackling this question, and of course leveraging all the good knowledge that's out there. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Lena, a question for you. I saw coming up at the chat several times. Why did El Salvador put that efforts in, you know, money, resources in that restoration? What made it that it was so compelling? You know, there are so many needs in El Salvador. What did it make it compelling to move forward, say we really need to put effort in this restoration?
Sorry. Obviously, El Salvador is a small country with a very difficulties in terms of our budget in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. But actually, for us, it was, I don't know, it's a matter of life. I mean, we have a very degraded country. We have a lot of problems. The dry corridor, we are part of the dry corridor. And of course, the most important thing, we are one of the major region in the planet with the effect of the climate change putting at risk all our people. So for us, it's about no, it's an urgent matter. We need to restore the country. And it's also for us a common vision to be part of the multilateralism, to be part of this initiative, to be part of the Bond Challenge, the 2020 initiative. And if you are in there, it's easy to find the resources to do this. And because of that, WRI, it's part of us. We work together. We try to build a very strong monitoring system, the index of sustainability. And actually, to be a small country is a very good issue because we are like a laboratory. Everybody wants to go there, and you can see, and it's very impressive because you can see the landscape in my country. You can see the different part of this landscape and the interrelation between of these parts. So for us, it's a common vision, a flexible framework, but most important to have evidence, not only for making the policy, but also to understand what happened, to monitor the progress, and to show all the people that the money that they are invest in our country is good for them and not only for us. So I don't know, for us it's like we need to do it, we have to do it. And I encourage every country to do the same. I mean, I'm convinced that we did a great job because of you and because other partners.
Thanks, Lena. You know, it's great, passionate speech also, you know, to think about why some countries just need to do it. It's not like it's fun to do, but we need to do it.
Yeah.
I have another question for Bernadette. I mean, if you go to the many of the different questions I saw in the chat, many people like, but how do we bring those sophisticated tools to the local people who want to restore? I say to Bernadette, but please, other panelists, that could be also, but maybe you can open, Bernadette.
Yeah, I mean, one way we do this, I have already mentioned that we use a participatory approach, using people, working with the people in the landscape or in the countries where we are working, and involving them throughout the whole process so that they not only collect data that are useful for them, but also learn how the tool works. And at WRI, we have also started to think about having some form of, you know, restoration academy where we are training, especially the youth, in the use of this technology, and learn how they can monitor landscape or restoration in the various places where they live. So we are definitely thinking about making this tool more widely accessible in the various places where we are working, and making sure like each stakeholders, we are tailoring them to their skills, but also making them, helping them learn how to use them to help with where they are.
Maybe Renee, I think you also have worked very close with people in the landscape. Can you tell me a little bit how you involve those local people, at least in the landscape or even projects?
Yeah, no, that's important. And what we have been doing in Latin America in general, I am Guatemalan, and it's having these national or local roundtables where you have different sectors, because depending on if you're a farmer that are producing corn, for example, you have your view about the land, and if you have cows, you have your view about the land, and in a landscape perspective, you have different views and you have different uses, and understanding each of them has been, I mean, it's an important component to define the objectives. We apply a methodology that we, colleagues of mine developed in WRI, that is called the social landscapes, because, you know, you need to understand the perception of the people, because it's not a fact, but the perception of the people. If you go out to a restaurant, you probably go because there are good drinks, not because of the food. But you might think, the rationality thing, you will tell you, yeah, you will go because that's the best chicken in the world. But it's going because maybe he likes the, I don't know, the type of drinks that they have there, or just the people that attends there. And it's the same with the landscape, it's perceptions, and we need to understand the perceptions of the people from the different perspectives. Thanks.
Thanks, Renee. Yeah, the local perspective is very important indeed to get those tools there. Again, there are so many questions, and many questions are on biodiversity, and you know, how do we measure it? And Crystal, I come to you on that again, because you know, you have dealt with those issues also for some time. It's like, how do we incorporate those, you know, important things as, you know, as we see tree cover loss and tree cover gain, how do we get that to biodiversity, into carbon, and make sure that we come to some important information? Can you tell us a little bit how GFW was dealing that, and how maybe we at Restoration have to look at that?
Sure, this is a challenging question, and one that we haven't perfectly tackled yet with Global Forest Watch. There is quite a bit of biodiversity data available in the world, but a lot of it is very locally produced and disaggregated. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to bring that data together in a way that would allow us to combine it with our tree cover change data, so we can have analyses that show us what the impacts of tree cover loss and tree cover gain have on existing biodiversity within a landscape, a country, or globally. We're starting to develop some exciting new metrics, looking at the role that fragmentation and loss of connectivity can play, and looking at where we can see the most intact and significant biodiversity remaining in existing forest areas. But I think there's still a lot of work left to be done in this space.
Thanks, Crystal. I think we have time for one more question, and you know, I'd like to give that question again to Lina. So, you know, on the restoration, the world stage, what do you envision in 2030 where we would be, or where we need to be, and do you think we'll manage to be there?
Actually, I'm very positive. I mean, we're not going to have another opportunity, as Elke said. We don't have another opportunity. We need to work together. And I mean, when I launched the initiative of the Ecosystem Restoration Decade, I imagined that nobody it will be part of this initiative. And my surprise was everybody was on board. And we have a fantastic partners in this journey. Germany is the biggest one, of course, but there are a lot of fantastic partners. FAO is one of them, the new platform that we launched recently, the Hand in Hand Geospatial Platform, WRI, IUCN, the Bond Challenge. We are going to do it. We need to do it. There is not going to be another planet or another chance. And we have all the tools, the mechanism. I really encourage everybody to look these partners, to embrace this initiative. WRI is one of the best of doing this. And even if you are small, even if you are in a village, even if you are part of a big initiative, we have the responsibility. And we're gonna do it. 2030, it's gonna be a very good decade, of course.
Thank you, Lina. That's a very positive way to end this panel discussion. I thank Katie, Bernadette, Crystal, Renee, and Lina for this. And I'll give it over to our restoration manager, Dow, for the last few words.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today for our session on advances in monitoring forest and landscape restoration. The links to the webinar will be sent out right after the session closes. And for a short recap of all our work at global, landscape, and project scales, please check out our story map. It's out now. And if you'd like to learn more about our journey, follow us on Twitter at RestoreForward. And if you have any more questions, if we didn't get to them, please email us at restoration.monitoring@wri.org. Thank you, stay safe, and be well.